So welcome to, and nice to meet everybody. So today we're going to go over the Introduction to Literature classes that we've developed, launching for next term. So for these classes, we've labeled them GL101 and GL102, standing for Global Admissions, and they're called Intro to Literature 1 and 2. These classes basically are taking, so with the new master's program, we still wanted to keep some of the content from the previous literature and the non-literature tracks. And so the goal of these two programs was to kind of take the previous L100 series and based on feedback from instructors and from our own experiences teaching these different classes, which books the kids actually cared about, and then try to pick basically the top ones and condense them down into about these two different programs here. So 101 and 102, they're both, the idea is that both of them are kind of introductory level classes for masters, so that especially if a branch has pre-master's class, this would be suitable for that kind of class. And then so the books that we selected are we try to have kind of the structure sort of match between the two. So both classes structure-wise are almost identical. It's just the content is different based on the books themselves. So L101 has kind of the theme of more kind of coming of age stories. So we have The Giver, Lord of the Flies, and Ender's Game. And then 102 is a bit more the kind of the social issue kind of books. And so we have The Outsiders, The Great Gatsby, and The Book Thief. And sort of the order of the books too was kind of tried to mirror each other with sort of the fun YA book first, sort of the more literary book second, and then the longer kind of contemporary YA book as the last part of the class. So I'm going to go through the segment guide and the syllabus here, as well as some of the other content that's available in the FTP. But basically, each book has been broken down to having roughly 50 to 75 pages of reading each week, with the exception of The Book Thief. Because it's so long, there's going to be some chunks where the kids have to read quite a bit. But because it's kind of more contemporary language and the way it's printed, I think it's doable for the most part. Okay, so for this class, to syllabus, blah, blah. The overall goal of the class is to get students to understand sort of a lot of basic literary terms, literary devices, and elements, and how to apply that in their analysis of the reading, as well as their own writing, and into discussion in the class. So a lot of the other master's programs that we've made have a lot of fiction in it, and it's, it'd be good to have the students have a solid foundation in discussing that, so that the discussions in those classes are a bit more meaningful. A lot of these skills are also things that would have been taught to them in some of these things they would already know conceptually, and other things in V1 classes, ostensibly they should have learned as well. But nothing wrong with repeating and kind of getting them to see a more advanced take on kind of the same idea. All right, so the class structure here. For most of the lessons, this is kind of the basic breakdown. So the first bit of class, login, attendance, vocab test will begin starting in week 2. Then in the first section, the kind of the scout pages is to recap, review whatever was going on in the previous weeks, introducing the kind of essential questions related to whatever the week's readings are. And if there's any sort of additional assigned homework that you want to give, which I'll go over, there's nothing mandatory for the class, but I just had some ideas for homework that can encourage students to actually keep up with the reading. Because I'm sure those of you know who taught, V1 or any literature-based class, the biggest problem is if the students don't do the reading, then what happens? So we try to develop these lessons to be with the idea that the class is supposed to work with students having actually read the book, but if they didn't read the book, it should still be able to run more or less. So anyways, the scout pages, kind of introducing the class, kind of getting them to recap, remember what happened the previous weeks before. For the lessons that are the first day of the book, so week 1, week 5, and week 9, I believe, the scout page has a little bit more introductory stuff in terms of getting them little activities and stuff to talk more about what the book is going to be about. It's kind of a pre-reading task. The dive pages are the bulk of the class. These are going through similar to the some of the previous L100 classes had this, like L102, 104, 105. I think 101 through 105 was pretty good with this, but just having like pages with close reading excerpts from the book and questions related to that. Then the next part will be the explore section, which is a skill lesson regarding literary elements or devices or writing skills related to what their task is going to be in the final hour. And these skill lessons are pretty divorced from the book specifically. There will be some parts that are related directly to the books, but the idea here is that regardless of whether or not they read the book, there are definitely like other things that they know from movies or TV or whatever that they can apply or consider as examples. And then finally, last hour will be the project. And then for the projects for this class, we've got basically 3 different styles of projects. Go to the syllabus. Which is either creative projects like PPT style stuff, creative writing, and then analytical writing. So that just having a kind of variety there so that they do some different stuff. And then the analytical writing mostly focused on like as they finish each of the books. So at the last week of The Giver, last week of Lord of the Flies, like writing in class, like an essay analyzing whatever the kind of thematic ideas or symbolism and stuff analysis that we have. And the idea for those is that the students would start it in class and then finish it as part of their iLearning homework. And that'll be their iLearning assignment for that week. Okay, lesson 13 is going to be a final presentation. I'll go over what the final project and presentation actually is. So that day is just basically dedicated for the students to present. For these classes, if you have a class that's quite small, like in the past doing this, I've had classes where I have like 3 kids show up on the last week, in which case the final presentations kind of go out the window. For that, I've done things like made them present much longer than they should have originally, or just done some other activity with like some short story or something, or poems, just some other things. But that's kind of more something you'll have to improvise on the fly if that comes up. Okay. So for this class, let me go through the actual lessons first. So for the summer term, lessons 1 through 4 are available on the teachers portal. So if you just go to summer term, GL101 is the giver track, GL102 is the outsiders track. Although I noticed, I think lesson 2 is kind of bugged here, so it doesn't load. The other ones, though, I think are fine. What I saw. Okay. So yeah, so for both of them, lesson 1 starts with a few pages of kind of introductory stuff. The page 2, page 3 are about just kind of introducing literature in general. Page 3 is about introducing the specific genre that the term is going to be about. So for these, you can have the students either read together or just kind of go over the concepts without necessarily having the students read the actual content. Because in lesson 1, we like even, regardless of if the students read every week, we generally assume lesson 1, the students don't do any reading coming into the class. So for the syllabus, I've tried to have like just a few pages of like the first chapter or the first 2 chapters that you can actually spend some time in class reading together as a class, either just silently or maybe just some popcorn reading. Although in the dive pages, there are specific excerpts that will highlight like what are the major points that we need from those pages. I like the giver part, pages 1 to 24, probably not super realistic having them read it in class, but the outsiders, the first chapter is just 12 pages, so you could totally read this in the actual class. So this just introducing the overall concept of the class. When we're discussing literary like terms, I tried to separate this out into kind of 2 categories: literary elements, meaning things that are like universal to like all literary stuff, all stories stuff, and literary devices being more specific techniques that authors use. I know there's a lot of different terms that are used, but this is just like what I like to use for this particular categorization of stuff. This one about coming of age genre and like discussion questions related to the concept. And the last scout page just kind of gives a brief introduction to what the book is about, as well as some discussion questions, activities that you can do with the class. all the like discussion questions and stuff here are just like really, suggestions rather than things you necessarily have to do. Right? Of course, if it's not interesting in your mind, feel free to adjust the questions as you will to something that would be more effective for what you feel your students will be interested in talking about. So each of the pages here for the dive pages have like passage excerpt from the book, as well as a couple questions related to what happened in the excerpt. Some of the questions will be like more personalized questions to get them to get their own thoughts about their life. Some of them will just be purely comprehension questions from like, what is this part of the book talking about? Some of these excerpts, the idea is that like the students have done the reading of everything. So it's just like kind of a placeholder to be like, okay, this is the part of the book that we're discussing here. And because we couldn't just put like every single part of the book for some of these later, like especially Ender's Game and the Book Thief, because they're much more heavy page-wise. There's a lot of like sections of the book that we just kind of had to skip over because we couldn't fit everything into the structure that we have. So there might be some key points in the story that you feel were not addressed, which you can just include as discussion points within your class. And then the Explore page, each one will have some information background about the Explore page. The idea here would be also to incorporate a lot of media cards using other sources, which would have relevant setting, role building ideas or characterization, etc., like movie clips, things like that. And then for these pages, we'll have some questions and an activity towards the bottom that you can use related to whatever the topic is. And feel free to, of course, incorporate whatever other activities you think would be interesting in relation to these literary ideas. If you don't particularly care for the specific devices discussed in each of those lessons, or if you feel that perhaps you've already discussed it and maybe it's a little redundant, because some of them are a bit redundant maybe, so something that could have come up previously and you may have already just talked about offhand. Feel free to adjust that as much as you want, but it'll just be kind of up to you to construct whatever else you want to add in lieu of the included Explore pages. For the projects, they're broken down into four sections: frame, ideate, or sorry, just three. Frame, ideate, materialize, because materialize includes the presentation part. But basically frame, introducing the project, what the goal is going to be. Ideate, planning out what the project is. And then the materialize, make the project or writing, and then presentation, feedback, etc. Again, for these, like with any of the other projects, like in C2 or B1, if you want to adjust the project as much as you want, feel free to do so. Okay, and then for kind of other related notes, so in the segment guide, there's some notes here about what you can assign as additional homework for checking reading comprehension. The course assumes that the students will have done the reading for the week, but also the dive pages are structured such that if the kid didn't do any of the reading, as you go through sort of the key excerpts, they'll be able to get what happened overall with the plot, the events of the story. Obviously, we want the students to do the homework, but from branch to branch, I think there's, with younger students, it's a bit easier. Older students, obviously, with exams and stuff, they tend to get busy. And then, like, what actual disciplinary action can be taken to students that don't do the homework kind of is, very dependent on the branch. So as kind of two ideas I had for what you could do for reading comprehension, one that I do for my classes is just this homework assignment that's just like very basic quote notes, where essentially the students, as they read, they need to write down 10 quotes that they think are important from the book for some reason, as well as the page number and a note explaining why they believe that quote was important. This could be anything from just like parts that they enjoyed from the book, parts they thought were confusing. And ideally, later into the term, once the students have a good foundation of different literary terms, devices that you've discussed, they'll be able to pinpoint like, hey, this is a metaphor. Hey, this is like, I think this is an important symbol for something, blah, blah, blah. Or this shows that this character is blah, blah, blah. So going a little more of the literary analysis point. And then, so just assigning this, and then we'll usually just check this at the beginning of class. I don't always check very carefully. I mostly just check for completion's sake, see whether or not they did it. Another alternative would be creating weekly reading quizzes. We do not have any material for this, so you would have to create your own tests if you want to do this. We considered maybe doing this as part of the class, but we decided not to because ultimately, like, a reading quiz eats up a lot of time in the class, and it serves a purpose, but I feel like the purpose of the class shouldn't necessarily be to like memorize what happened in the book, but rather to get the students to talk about the book, whatever it is. So to minimize maximize the discussion, I want to avoid doing this. But in the past, like teaching other literature classes, I found that sometimes like I'll just do this, make a little quiz just to get the kids like started and understanding that, hey, we need to read at least something from the book. There's some notes about conducting class discussions, different strategies you can use. For the dive pages, my idea would be not to necessarily just like go through the pages one by one and then like answer like, oh, okay, let's read this question, let's answer this question. But to make it a bit more dynamic, whether it's like for each dive page, like having the students break up into teams and discuss the questions on the relevant page with each other, and then bring into a class, like think, pair, share kind of strategy. And just trying to do different things with class discussion going through the books. Goes over the pages. Okay. And towards the end of the term, kind of the final project for the class is to have the students write an essay that's analyzing one or more of the 3 novels that they chose for the term, and writing the essay in like proper MLA formatting style as well. And then also doing a presentation in week 13 that is going to, does one explain it very well? Okay, well, there's a presentation here. But so the main thing is writing the essay, and then for week 13, a presentation that's not a presentation of their essay, but a slightly separate project, which they'll work on in week 12 and then work on as their homework, because there's no reading homework going into week 13. So their homework should just be working on their presentation. And the presentation is taking one of the literary devices or literary elements or devices that we learned about in the term, and then explaining it to the class, and then finding another creative work, whether it's another book or a movie or a video game or music even, and applying that literary device to that work and analyzing that work and introducing that work to the class. Okay, so in the segment guide, there's explanations of the different parts of the project as well as the timeline. So in week 10 will be when the project is introduced, and at the end of the class, we will choose prompts, start outlining, brainstorming, outlining what the essay will be. They'll have the rough draft coming in week 11, and then the project for that week will be dedicated to workshopping their essay, their draft, and then week 12 would be their final draft is due, and then they'll work on their presentation planning. So for the sake of the final project, there's also some material in the FTP that has a term paper overview of like what all the things they need to do and follow. So this can be printed for the students, as well as like a big outline that the students can go through. So basically the structure: intro, 3 body paragraphs, each with at least one piece of textual evidence within the page, and then works cited at the bottom as well. There's a rubric for the term paper. Feel free to use this or not use it. I just personally like to give an actual letter grade to my students when doing these kinds of things, just because they feel good or bad about it, but they feel it's a bit more concrete and meaningful. And so this is just at 100 points, 10 different categories. This is just a handout for peer review if you want to do that. In the Smart textbook as well, there's some like sections for peer review to do, which have questions similar to this. I think they're not quite exactly the same, but they're relatively similar to that. So for those lessons haven't been uploaded to the portal yet, but basically in lesson 10, it'll have a breakdown of all these different like elements of what to do in the actual class. And actually, I guess I can just pull it up from my versions here. Lesson 10. Yeah, so an overview of the project, the different prompts. I've tried to come up with basically 2 prompts per book and then 2 prompts that would address multiple books. But the students can also change the prompts. If you want to change the prompts as well, feel free to do that as well. I tried to make sure that your prompts were related to one of the literary elements devices covered in the lessons. And so this goes over kind of the basic structure, the rubric, as well as an example of what MLA style looks like. And then in some of the previous lessons, there are for lesson 4 and lesson 4 and lesson 7. These weeks have the actual like analytical writing in the class. So those will have projects that are dedicated to teaching the structure of writing and like a lit paper. So lesson 4, for example, yeah, so for here, the explore page is going into identifying themes, writing thesis statements based on thematic ideas from the novel, and then using like how to put in textual evidence and format textual evidence properly into the actual book. These are based on MLA formatting. And then like examples of like structures for paragraphs. I like to use the acronym MEAL or the mnemonic of MEAL for the style of paragraphs, example of paragraph, etc. And then so this project would be writing an essay about the book related to one of these prompts. And then they'll finish it as part of their e-learning. Any questions so far? Oh, okay. So the only other thing really to cover is what their e-learning stuff is. So for the e-learning, there's 2 parts. They'll have vocab, and they'll also have a critical application, which is a writing assignment. For the vocabulary, the students will have, I don't think we'll have, they won't have workbooks ready, so we'll have to just print the vocab lists for the students. But the vocab, one of the biggest differences with these vocab and the previous classes, like in 4.0, 3.0, is that the vocab will not be vocab for like the vocab test that they do in week 2 won't be words that are from the week 1 reading, but it'll be from words in the week 2 reading. So the idea is that the vocab words will actually be relevant to what their reading is, so that it'll help them with their reading. So the focus is more on like as a preview rather than a review. The actual vocab tests themselves are the first, I think there's 16 questions. The first 6 questions are matching, but there's no English to Korean matching. It's just English to English synonyms. So there's no, like in the vocab list as well, it's just like this English words with definitions only. And then the rest is fill in the blank. Although the fill in the blank is not a like matching like that, but typed out with grammar changes as well. To be honest, we were quite worried about having that style of vocab test, but I've been like running those vocab tests for one of the classes this term, and except for one student who's just kind of not very bright, every other kid gets like perfect scores on the test or close to perfect scores. So I think it turned out to be totally fine doing it that way. A lot of the questions are directly from their e-learning, like it's exactly identical. So some of the kids basically just memorize their e-learning homework completely and then just do that. So as long if the kids actually do their e-learning homework, the test actually isn't super difficult for them. But that's my personal experience. I don't know necessarily how it's gone with other branches because, yeah, so I don't really know too much feedback on that. Have you guys heard? Allison, Ben?
No. Does your vocab test lag? We heard yesterday that was lagging.
Depends on the tablets. Like we have some, like in my classroom, I have some new tablets and I have some old tablets. The new tablets are fine. The old tablets are not.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's the only thing we've heard.
And then for the e-learning, for the writing component, I don't have that here, but basically they're going to write just an essay, like a 300 around 300-word essay in response to a prompt related to one of the related to whatever the literary device that you talked about in the class. And for the iLearning, you don't need to grade it yourself. It's all going to be done like in the system as before. So you may want to check over it to make sure the students have completed it. And then once it's been graded, you can look at it through MERP. The exception, though, I would say is for this class, particularly the lesson 4 and 7 ones. You should make sure that the kids complete that and check through it. If you have classes where students don't do the iLearning at all, like I think for like the middle schoolers, they don't have to purchase the iLearning, or at least at my branch, that's how it works. Like they just don't even like offer it to them, or their parents avoid paying for it. But for these writing assignments, the kind of the actual essay ones, what you're going to do in class, if they don't do it on iLearning, at least have them like completed for homework, and then you can check it the week after, just to make sure that they're actually following the proper structure of how to write this kind of essay, this style of essay, because it's something that the students will probably have almost no experience with, writing like a style of essay that actually incorporates quotes. And there's like pretty much every single student will do this when they're first doing this, which is just like they have their idea, blah blah blah, like this is a symbol for love, blah blah blah, and they'll write a quote, and then they'll say like, see, that's why this is a symbol for love, and then they'll move on to the next paragraph, which I'm sure you guys have your own experience of doing that in English classes when you were younger. So just try to make sure the kids like learn to do better than that for their essays. Okay. And I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to say here. All of this stuff is in the FTP already. So here, if you go into the Cheongdam 22 summer and the master, it's under global admissions. So GL101 and GL102. A lot of this content is the same between the two. The only differences would be the syllabus and the vocab list. So structure-wise, they're kind of the same. My idea was basically for like, again, for like pre-master classes, like students first coming into masters, they would do 1 or maybe 2 terms of this, and then they would go on to the kind of more advanced stuff. And then 101, the books are a little bit easier than 102, although it's kind of pretty similar. But the themes of 102 are a bit more mature than the 101 ones, let's say. Although even that, whatever. Hey, any questions? Yeah, Thomas.
Are we able to get a copy of the documentation sometime today?
I could send it out in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thanks, man.
One more thing, just to emphasize what John was saying, please make sure to print out the vocab lists and give them to students each week, especially because something that we did find out yesterday, iLearning is actually optional for all master students.
Okay.
In general, yes. Students have the option to purchase iLearning, or they can choose not to purchase it. If they don't purchase that, that means they have no access to any of the vocab words because they don't have iLearning. So it is extremely important for you to print them out and hand them out to students every single week. They will be taking the vocab test regardless of if they purchased iLearning. So keep that in mind, make sure you print it and give it to your students. This goes for any master class. The only other thing there is that, like, yes, it's optional. So some students are like, oh, well, I didn't know this, blah, blah, blah. Like at the end of the day, they don't get learning points. Like for master students, they don't get points. They don't really level up past this. So it doesn't really affect them in any way, but they are required to take that vocab test. So please do print it.
Do you know if we'll ever have workbooks or nah?
Nope, you will never have workbooks for master. There's just not enough stuff to print into it for the most part. Yeah.
Thomas, did you want anything besides those 3, the syllabus and segment guides?
I mean, anything else that's useful would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the homework stuff. I guess I'll just upload everything.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wednesday.
Any other questions?
No, I just realized what I should also upload. I have a lot of old student essays I should upload, like an example.
Examples, yeah.